objectives are laudatory and worth pursuing, but on multiple occasions, senior administration officials have expressed aims that are incompatible and sometimes work at cross purposes with these goals. National Security Advisor John Bolton is a longtime proponent of regime change in Tehran. He continually questions the utility of negotiating with Iran and frequently indicates that the Iranian regime will not be in power in the coming years. President Trump regularly, including on a recent visit to Japan, said he is opposed to regime change. He has offered to negotiate with Iran without preconditions and claims that he seeks a deal solely to end Iran's nuclear program. But in a May 2018 speech, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, outlined 12 conditions that Tehran must fulfill, many of which are unrelated to the nuclear issue. So therefore, there is serious confusion about the intentions of our Iran policy and whether Mr. Bolton, President Trump, and Secretary Pompeo are working at cross purposes or even to achieve the same objectives. Second, the Trump administration's impulsive actions are isolating the United States from our allies, which makes it harder to counter Iran's nuclear and non-nuclear behavior. President Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA undermined U.S. credibility, undercut American leadership, and divided us from our allies. Now, I am no great defender of the JCPOA, but the agreement formalized international dialogue to address any Iranian violations or flaws in the accord, and by withdrawing, the Trump administration forfeited these mechanisms and frustrated global efforts to contain the Iranian nuclear threat. Furthermore, Iran recently announced that it would increase its stockpile of enriched uranium. Rather than confronting Iranian violations or addressing gaps and sunset concerns in the deal in concert with our allies and partners during negotiations, we instead face the challenge now with a fractured international community. Those divisions also make it harder to rally our allies to address Iran's non-nuclear activities, like its ballistic missile program and destabilizing regional activities. The fact became apparent in recent days. It is highly likely that Iran twice attacked civilian ships in the Gulf over the last month, but Congress would like to see that evidence before stating it as a fact. But these attacks are unacceptable and should unite the international community. However, as the administration sought to build a broad coalition to respond, close allies like Germany and Japan responded with skepticism, while adversaries like Russia and China signaled their support for Iran and stated that they would continue to develop ties with the Islamic Republic rather than lead a unified international response to an attack on global commerce. The Trump administration is having trouble convincing even our closest allies to push back on Iran. Third, despite the administration's claims, maximum pressure policy is ineffective. By the administration's own standards, deterring Tehran and countering further Iranian nuclear development. Those are the standards. And we've not seen success. The approach appears based on this assumption, that faced with massive sanctions, Tehran would capitulate, change its policies, and accede to U.S. demands. In fact, the opposite has occurred, as Iran escalated its regional and nuclear activities and rejected new negotiations. Sanctions have not compelled Iran to change its regional policies, which is not only my opinion, but the assessment of the head of Israeli military intelligence, who made that claim several weeks back. Fourth, it appears there is no process in place to reassess the assumptions underlying the administration's policy, consider alternatives, and change course. If the current trend continues, the Trump administration is likely to find a binary choice: back down in the face of Iran's aggressive behavior or engage in military action. And rather than force Iran back to the negotiating table, the administration's policy is increasing the chances of miscalculation, which then would bring the United States and Iran closer to a military conflict. And even more troubling, the administration seems to be suggesting that military action is covered by the 2001 AUMF, which I'd remind the administration there's broad bipartisan agreement that that's not the case. To reiterate, Congress has not authorized war with Iran. Mr. Hook, I hope you will clarify the administration's view on this issue. And finally, I would just close by pointing out that the challenges posed by Iran are too grave, the risk to our international alliance is too important, and the lives of our service members too sacred for Congress to abdicate its oversight responsibility and endorse a policy that we don't understand, that confuses our allies, and most importantly, that risks U.S. national security. And with that, I will turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, for calling this timely hearing. I'm grateful that we will be joined later today by the Republican leader, Mike McCall. His presence underscores how important the hearing is today. And thank you to our distinguished witness, Mr. Brian Hook, the U.S. Special Representative for Iran, for your testimony before the subcommittee today. Iran has been a persistent threat to the United States since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The Iranian regime is inherently hostile to the United States, and when the mullahs in Tehran chant "Death to America, death to Israel," they mean what they say, and they publish on billboards in English across the country the same chant of "Death to America, death to Israel." The Iranian regime's hostility to the United States, our interest in allies around the world, has continued unabated since 1979. Its most recent iteration came in the form of Iran's attack on oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman this past weekend. This latest attack, like all other Iranian attacks, was not the result of any one policy or another. United States policy did not cause Iran to become the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism. Iran has been engaged in this kind of behavior since the current regime in Tehran came to power. This kind of behavior is not an aberration or escalation. It is a hallmark of the Iranian regime statecraft. The notion that the Iranian regime somehow would moderate to a point in which it would no longer support such malign activity has proven false. When Iran finally felt the economic benefits of sanctions relief under the terms of the flawed nuclear agreement, did it cut back its support to the malign activity around the world? No. Instead, Iran doubled down on support of terrorist groups. It continued racing ahead and developing the ballistic missile program. It exploited the breathing room paid for by the international community to prop up the Assad regime in Syria and increase its influence in places like Yemen and Iraq. That's part of the reason that the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear agreement and reimposed sanctions on the Iranian regime. Initially, the Iranians believed that they could wait out the administration's maximum pressure campaign by appealing to the Europeans to try to find a way around U.S. sanctions, but they have not succeeded. Iran's economy is spiraling, contracting at a rate of 6% so far this year after contracting nearly 4% in 2018. Feeling the squeeze, the Iranian regime has decided to revert to its tried and tested terrorist behavior with the latest attack in the Gulf and its announcement this week of its intention to breach the nuclear deal. These are both tactics of desperation designed to give wind to arguments that the U.S. policy precipitated the Iranian bad behavior. The sanctions against Iran are working. We have already seen some dividends of the administration's maximum pressure campaign. Reports indicate that Iran has had to slash payments to the fighters in Syria by a third due to the pain of American sanctions. Even employees of Hezbollah have missed paychecks and lost perks. Iran's cyber unit has also lost substantial funding, and the IRGC's cuts forth budget has been reportedly cut by 17%. At the same time, the United States must prioritize bringing our friends and partners into the fight with us. We cannot and should not do this alone. After all, it was the international sanctions regime against Iran that finally brought the regime to the negotiating table, and we must bridge the divide with our European allies to be fully effective. We must restore deterrence against Iran, and that requires the cooperation of our friends and allies in the region and beyond. Mr. Hook, thank you again for your being here today. We look forward to your service and understand that you've really got a job ahead of you, but your background indicates that you can achieve. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. I'll now introduce our witness, Mr. Brian Hook. Mr. Hook currently serves as U.S. Special Representative for Iran and Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State. Prior to this appointment, he served as Director of the Policy Planning Staff from 2017 to 2018. He previously held multiple senior roles in the Bush administration, including Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations and Senior Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the UN. Mr. Hook managed an international strategic consulting firm from 2009 to 2017 and practiced law at Hogan Hartson from 1999 to 2003. We thank you for being here today. Mr. Hook, I'd ask you to please summarize your testimony in 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statement will be made part of the hearing record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate you inviting me today to testify before the committee and for devoting a hearing to discuss America's foreign policy to Iran. In my role as the United States Special Representative for Iran, I've made it a priority to stay coordinated with this committee. This administration has implemented an unprecedented pressure campaign with two primary objectives. First, to deprive the Iranian regime of the money it needs to support its destabilizing activities. Second, to bring Iran back to the negotiating table, to conclude a comprehensive and enduring deal, as outlined by Secretary Pompeo in May of 2018, shortly after the President left the Iran deal. President Trump and Secretary Pompeo have expressed very clearly our willingness to negotiate with Iran when the time is right. No one should be uncertain about our desire for peace or our readiness to normalize relations should we reach a comprehensive deal. We have put the possibility of a much brighter future on the table for the Iranian people, and we mean it. The comprehensive deal we seek with the Iranian regime should address four key areas: its nuclear program, its ballistic missile development and proliferation, its lethal support and financial support to terrorist groups and proxies, and its arbitrary detention of U.S. citizens, including, as Chairman Deutsch pointed out, Bob Levinson, who was your constituent, as well as Siamak Namazi and Xiuye Wang and others. Over a year ago, Secretary Pompeo laid out 12 demands describing the negotiated outcomes that we seek. We did not invent this list. In fact, the requirements that the Secretary laid out simply reflect the wide extent of Iran's malign behavior, as well as the global consensus that is reflected in multiple UN Security Council resolutions that were passed from 2006 up until around 2011. Before we reimposed our sanctions and accelerated our pressure, Iran was increasing the scope of its malign activity. It was emboldened by the resources and legitimacy that the nuclear deal granted. This includes engaging in expansive missile testing and proliferation, activities that I can confirm did not diminish after implementation of the nuclear deal in 2016. And Iran also continued after the deal to detain innocent American citizens. Iran also deepened its engagement in regional conflicts, intensifying, prolonging, and deepening the conflicts. In Yemen, for example, Iran helped to fuel a humanitarian catastrophe by providing funding, weapons, and training to the Houthis. Its support has only prolonged the suffering of the Yemeni people. Looking at Syria, Iran supported Assad's war machine as the Syrian regime killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions, creating the worst refugee crisis since World War II. Under the cover of the Syrian civil war, Iran is now trying to plant deep military roots in Syria and to establish Syria as a forward-deployed missile base to threaten Syria's neighbors, especially Israel. In Lebanon, Iran uses Hezbollah for many decades to provoke conflict with Lebanon's neighbors, threaten the safety of the Lebanese people, and imperil prospects for stability. Our pressure is aimed at reversing these trends. Today, by nearly every metric, the regime and its proxies are weaker than when our pressure began. Shia militant groups in Syria have stated that Iran no longer has enough money to pay them, as much as they have in the past. Hezbollah and Hamas have enacted unprecedented austerity plans due to a lack of funding from Iran. In March, Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah went on TV and made a public appeal for donations. Hezbollah has placed piggy banks in grocery stores and in retail outlets seeking the spare change of people. We are also making it harder for Iran to expand its own military capabilities. Beginning in 2014, when the deal was near completion, Iran's military budget increased every year through 2017. When we put our pressure into effect starting in 2017 and 2018, in the first year we saw a reduction in Iran's military spending by 10%, and in March, their most recent budget has a 28% cut in defense spending, and that includes a 17% cut for IRGC funding. The IRGC's Cyber Command is now low on funding, and the IRGC has told Iraq's Shia militia groups that they need to start looking for new sources of revenue. Our pressure campaign is working. It is making Iran's violent and expansionist foreign policy cost prohibitive. And I would say that our policy at its core is an economic and diplomatic one. But Iran has not responded to this in a diplomatic fashion. It has responded to it with violence, and we very much believe that Iran should meet diplomacy with diplomacy, not with terror, bloodshed, and extortion. Our diplomacy, our economic pressure, and diplomatic isolation do not entitle Iran to undertake violence against any nation or to threaten maritime security. Happy to wrap it up there unless you'd like me to finish. I want to be respectful of the time limit.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. We appreciate your yielding back and appreciate your testimony. I'll start the questions. Mr. Hook, the Iraq War was not that long ago. I wasn't in Congress when the Bush administration was making its claims about weapons of mass destruction. Many of us weren't here then, but John Bolton was. As Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, Bolton made misleading or false statements about biological weapons in Cuba, weapons in Syria, and of course, about Iraq's development and stockpile of WMDs. Before entering the White House, he advocated for preemptive strikes against North Korea and Iran. So you can understand why many of us are uneasy when we read articles that quote former U.S. intel officials about shoehorning intelligence to fit a certain policy, or former State Department officials saying the pattern that I've seen with Bolton then and subsequently is that he has established quite a track record of cherry-picking intelligence information that serves whatever case he's going to make. Mr. Hook, I know Mr. Bolton is not the only one driving policy, but I'm trying to lay out exactly why, despite our strong desire to take the Iran threat seriously and stop Iran's dangerous activities, there are legitimate concerns about taking the administration at its word. I appreciate that in your testimony that the policy is to avoid conflict, but there are a lot of people who fear that the policy is to provoke Iran, so the U.S. has no choice but to respond. And our job here in Congress is to make sure that we do not put U.S. men and women in harm's way without a darn good national security reason. So when Secretary Pompeo lists recent attacks, quote, instigated by the Islamic Republic of Iran and its surrogates against American and allied interests, and includes a bombing in Kabul that the Taliban had already taken responsibility for, and nearly every expert is surprised by the claim. We as elected representatives of the American people deserve to know what's behind the claim. Secretary Pompeo told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I quote, "There is no doubt there is a connection between the Islamic Republic of Iran and al-Qaeda, period, full stop. The factual question with respect to Iran's connections to al-Qaeda is very real. They have hosted al-Qaeda. They have permitted al-Qaeda to transit their country," close quote. I would refer you, Mr. Hook, to the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, in which it says, "The President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons." Mr. Hook, is the administration preparing to tell Congress that it has the authority to launch military action against Iran because one of Osama bin Laden's sons has been living in Iran?
May I first start with the intelligence that you mentioned? I think last weekend, the House Intelligence Committee chairman said that the evidence of Iran's responsibility for the attacks is, quote, very strong and compelling. There was no cherry picking of intelligence.
I understand, but I'd ask the question again. the concern, obviously, is that some of these statements that I've read suggest that the administration is prepared to say that it has the authority to launch military action against Iran because, under the 2001 AUMF, because one of Osama bin Laden's sons has been living there. How about because there are former al-Qaeda members living in or transiting through Iran? Is that enough to justify reliance on the 2001 AUMF to take military action against Iran?
Well, I'm happy to answer the question. I just want to first underline, as I said in my opening statement, that we are not—
I understand the policy. I appreciate
No, I'm saying
that.
we're not seeking military action.
And I'm grateful for that. I'm just talking about the concerns we have based on the statements that have been made. Is the administration preparing to tell Congress that it has the authority to launch military action against Iran because there is direct evidence of Iran having operational control over al-Qaeda?
If the use of military force is necessary to defend U.S. national security interests, we will do everything that we are required to do with respect to congressional war powers, and we will comply with the law.
I understand and I appreciate that. I would just ask again, is there, based on what I've laid out in the statements made by the Secretary and the National Security Advisor, do you believe that the administration could launch an attack against Iran under the 2001 AUMF?
This is something which the Office of the Legal Advisor can give you an opinion on. If you'd like to submit it, that is a legal question.
We will submit that. In the meantime, I would just remind you, Mr. Hook, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war. I'd ask that you remind the President of the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State of that. And finally, in my remaining seconds, I appreciate you raising Bob Levinson in your testimony. I just have one more simple question. What exactly is the administration doing to help bring Bob Levinson home?
When we were in the Iran nuclear deal, the last meeting of the Joint Commission, which is the members plus the EU, I was in Vienna and I requested a meeting with Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister. And I raised the cases of all of the American citizens who are being unjustly and arbitrarily detained in Iran. I demanded their release. I asked for an update for each of them. We have our special envoy, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who is working his entire life, his professional life is devoted to this, trying to bring Americans home. We are completely committed to this. What we have demanded is that Iran release these citizens. They are innocent, and they need to be released. They know that. Conversations with the foreign ministry, which is often in the dark on these matters, not always very fruitful, but we are pursuing every avenue possible.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Hook, Iran's ballistic missile program continues to advance because of the assistance of Chinese proliferators. While the State Department has taken steps to curb this proliferation, most recently sanctioning these individuals on May 22nd, they have shown adeptness at circumventing previous restrictions and continuing to support Iran's missile arsenal. Beyond the most recent sanctions, can you elaborate on the efforts undertaken by the administration to counter Chinese weapons proliferation to Iran?
We have made it very clear to the Chinese, both publicly and privately, that we will sanction any sanctionable activity. And I think nations around the world know that we have undertaken this campaign of diplomatic isolation and economic pressure with great seriousness of purpose. And I think as a consequence, we are seeing historic levels of compliance with American sanctions, especially the oil sanctions. So we have now zeroed out Iran's exports of Iranian crude oil, and we are confident that nations are going to comply with that. Whether it's an arms embargo, Iran is still under an arms embargo. I will remind the committee that that embargo expires in 17 months under UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which memorialized this deal. It also lifts the travel ban on General Qasem Soleimani. And so we need to be looking ahead. I went up to the UN Security Council and briefed the entire council in early May to talk about the concerns we have about provisions that are going to start expiring. The world's leading state sponsor of terrorism should not have an arms embargo lifted, but that is the path that we are on. In October of 2020, the arms embargo expires, and so do some of the travel bans. So we think that's one of the reasons why we thought it was prudent to leave the deal. Puts us in a much better position to sanction arms embargo violations, and we are committed to doing that.
In line with that, on June the 12th, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels launched a cruise missile at Aba International Airport in Saudi Arabia, wounding 26 civilians. You have previously stated that Tehran will be held accountable for the attacks of its proxies. How will the United States hold Tehran accountable for the Houthi rebels' increased aggression against civilian targets?
Well, we've been certainly trying to improve the competencies and the capabilities of our partners in the region who are on the front lines of Iranian aggression, so that they are, if they are attacked, and the Saudi East-West pipeline was attacked, you had a Saudi tanker attacked, an Emirati tanker, a Norwegian tanker. That investigation for some of those countries is still ongoing. We very much support these countries in their right to defend when attacked, especially by Houthi rebels. Iran has, the Islamic Republic of Iran has spent hundreds of millions of dollars organizing, training, and equipping the Houthis to fight at a level beyond which makes any normal sense. And it has prolonged and intensified the conflict. So we certainly would like to see a political solution so that we can bring the fighting to an end and end the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. Iran has been a key player on this, and Iran is playing a very long game in Yemen. They would very much like to do in Yemen what they've been able to do in Lebanon, and to use the Houthis in the same model that they've used Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so we're looking very closely at that. We have now had half a dozen attacks. Mr. Ranking Member, you mentioned one of them. We've had a half a dozen attacks in roughly about the last month and a half. And this is why we decided to enhance our force posture in the region so that we can reestablish deterrence.
And with the half dozen attacks, and now recently this week, the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia have identified that the United States' assessment of Iran's responsibility is clear. And additionally, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said there's strong evidence Iran is to be blamed for the attacks. Is there any more that you can share with us about identification?
You're right, and it's important to highlight that I mentioned earlier the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee identifying Iran, but you've also had Chancellor Merkel, the UK Foreign Minister, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has also done that. I can just add some new information to this. Our intelligence confirms that Iranian vessels operating in and around the Strait of Hormuz on June 12th and 13th approached both the Front Altair and the Kokuka Courageous before each vessel suffered explosions. We assess this activity as consistent with an Iranian operation to attach limpet mines to the vessels. And I can also say that a senior IRGC official confirmed that IRGC personnel had completed 2 actions. So we're going to keep doing what we can to declassify intelligence without compromising sources and methods. But those who have been able to see the intelligence, and you've mentioned many of those people, all come away without any question that Iran is behind these attacks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We're joined by the Chairman and Ranking Member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'll recognize Mr. Engel for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch. Ranking Member Wilson, thank you for calling this hearing, and Special Representative Hook, thank you for appearing here today. I have been among the biggest critics of the Tehran regime in Congress. I didn't vote for the JCPOA because I felt it didn't prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons. It only postponed it. I didn't like the fact that they would be awash with cash to continue their terrorist activities. Iran is the world's most prolific state sponsor of terrorism. Its support for the Assad regime, its abysmal record on human rights, its imprisonment of Americans, and all this harmful behavior has isolated Iran and made them a threat to our security and that of our allies and partners. These destabilizing and dangerous behaviors must end. And frankly, Iran's recent attacks on tankers in the Straits of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman are setting the region on a course to war. We obviously need to de-escalate this situation before the worst happens. However, the administration's most recent steps seem to be pushing us more toward confrontation than negotiation. The carrier group rushing through the arms sale to Saudi Arabia, and we did a lot of work on that in this committee last week, coming up with a phony emergency to circumvent Congress and get these missiles to Saudi Arabia, putting more boots on the ground for supposedly defensive reasons, all framed by increasingly belligerent rhetoric. It does bother me because we should be trying to prevent confrontation. So I want to tell you what I see, Mr. Hook. I see a growing risk of miscalculation. I see more and more scenarios that could spark a conflict that could lead to the United States stumbling into war. And what I'd like to hear from the administration is the clearest possible statement that the United States is not looking for a war with Iran and how we can get Iran back to the negotiating table. And if we can't hear that from the administration, I want to make it very clear, Mr. Hook, that military action against Iran without the approval of Congress is absolutely not an option. Congress has co-equal powers under the Constitution. And, you know, we went through 20 years of going along with wars because we were told certain things were a fact when, in fact, they weren't. So I think that Congress has to play a major role. And the AUMF of 2001 has no relevance to the situation with Iran today. And I will resist the administration using that as an excuse to go to war. If the administration sees a threat that requires military force against Iran, your first step is right here on Capitol Hill. There is no law, no aging authorization from another conflict, that's the 2001 AUMF, that could apply to war against Iran. The administration would need prior authorization from Congress before going to war. So I want to just make my position very clear and say that my opinions of the Iranian regime have not changed. They're dangerous. They're the most dangerous regime in the Middle East, and they're the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. But that's not an excuse for the United States to plunge into another war without congressional approval. Let me ask you this, Mr. Hook. Secretary Pompeo said last week that Iran was conducting these attacks in the Gulf to convince the United States to lift its, and I quote him, successful maximum pressure campaign, unquote. While sanctions and other forms of pressure have undoubtedly hampered Iran's economy, there's little indication they have changed the behavior of the Iranian government or reduced Tehran's regional influence. So how would you define success in terms of the maximum pressure campaign?
In my opening statement, I presented a number of things that we are seeing in the region that suggest that Iran's proxies do not have the financial means that they used to under the Iran deal because our sanctions are denying the regime historic levels of revenue. Iran provides Hezbollah, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure as you know, 70% of its operating budget. That's $700 million a year. The leader of Hezbollah in March had to make a public appeal for donations. It's the first time they've done that in their history. You have Shia proxies in Syria saying to the New York Times, the golden days are gone and they're never coming back. Iran does not have the money that it used to. I mentioned there has been a 28% cut to Iran's military budget in March. During the Iran nuclear deal, Iran's military spending reached record levels. So our sanctions are working, and they are denying the regime the revenue that it otherwise would spend on Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Shia proxies in Syria, Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, underground groups in Bahrain. And so that's a very good thing. It is also the case that Iran has never come to the negotiating table in its 40-year history without pressure. And prior administrations have, sorry.
So can I, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to, it's in reference to what you're saying now. So is our ultimate goal, or is the administration's ultimate goal, to compel Iran to negotiate? And does your strategy match the intelligence community's assessment on how to get Iran to negotiate?
It does. It does.
It does. Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my time is out.
Thank you, Chairman Engel. Ranking Member McCall, you're recognized.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member, I have a very brief statement. I have a couple of questions. Just last week, Norwegian and Japanese oil tankers lawfully traversing the Gulf of Oman were attacked by Iran. We've all seen the evidence for ourselves. This was Iran's second attack on international shipping in weeks. Moreover, Iran attempted to shoot down a U.S. surveillance drone in the area. These attacks were no coincidence. Within days of the administration's announcement, they would no longer grant waivers for Iranian oil. Tehran responded with threats to protect and defend Iran's waterway as a retaliatory measure. This spring, Iran displayed propaganda on a billboard in downtown Tehran showing United States and Israeli ships being sunk in a battle. The billboard read in English, Farsi, Hebrew, and Arabic, "We drowned them all." Total propaganda, not to mention the fact they fired a rocket at our embassy in Iraq. Iran continues to flout UN Security Council ballistic missile sanctions. They continue to enable its network proxies to wreak havoc. In fact, the top general in Iran called for prepare for war to the proxies. Our general said the threat is imminent. A particular concern are the Houthi attacks on Saudi oil fields and airports. The threat Iran poses to the United States goes back to 1979 and the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and has continued with the deaths of 600 servicemen from 2003 to 2011, which Iran bears responsibility for. In May, the threat to U.S. personnel in Iraq was judged so significant that many of our diplomats were evacuated. A few days later, as I mentioned earlier, a rocket landed near the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Iran's announcement that it will begin enriching and stockpiling uranium in violation of international commitments should concern everyone on the planet. All of these actions reveal desperation on the part of Iran. In my view, the sanctions are working. It is crippling Iran. It's crippling their economy. They are cash-starved, and Hezbollah now is begging for cash. To me, these are all positive signs. Their cries for attention are a call for action for the United States and our allies. I believe our maximum campaign pressure campaign is working. We must continue to meet their aggression with forceful diplomacy. I believe all of us, the administration, Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, agree that peace is preferable to war. No one wants to see military action against Iran, but rest assured the United States will be prepared to respond to any attacks against our security and security in the region. My question has to deal with the 1,000 troops that have been deployed in the region and our military assets, and what is the purpose for their presence, and do we have any contingency military plans?
Thank you for your statement, Mr. Ranking Member. Yesterday, Secretary Pompeo and I traveled to Tampa, Florida, and met with the new commanding generals of both CENTCOM and SOCOM. We had very good discussions while we were there. We want to make sure that we are deeply coordinated with the Defense Department across a broad range of issues. As you pointed out, we have sent about 1,000 additional troops to the region. The decision to deploy to expedite the passage of the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was made on May 3rd. We started in late April and early May, started to receive very credible and very disturbing intelligence threat streams that Iran was plotting attacks against American interests in multiple theaters. And the President and his National Security Cabinet were in agreement that we needed to enhance our force posture in the region, which we've done. We think that that has helped to decrease the risk of miscalculation. And a lot of what we were concerned about at the time has not come to pass for the time being. We have not relaxed our vigilance against these threats from various vectors. And I think we have put in place the right kind of policy to restore deterrence against these attacks. What we have seen so far have not been on the scale that we have expected, but that does not mean that Iran is not capable of doing those things. But we have made it very clear that there will be severe consequences if Iran does go down that road.
I appreciate your message of deterrence and defending our allies in the region and our interest and commerce in the Straits of Hormuz, which is vitally important to energy throughout the world. I just want to conclude with this, Mr. Chairman, that in our Department of Defense approach bill that we will be voting on, there is a repeal. You talked about the AUMF, and I think it is something this committee, if God forbid we do go to war with Iran, which I don't think will happen. I think I think as Churchill talked about, weakness invites aggression. Reagan talked about strength through peace, peace through strength. You're showing strength. But in this DOD approach bill, it repeals the 2001 AUMF without a replacement. That would mean, Mr. Chairman, that all global counterterrorism operations worldwide will be unauthorized by Congress. I think this is a very dangerous move. I think we should reconsider that bill that's going to be voted on this week before the Congress. And with that, I yield back.
I thank Ranking Member McCall. Mr. Trone, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for your service. Like my colleagues, I'm concerned about what looks like deliberate attempts by the U.S. To be on a war footing with Iran. I'm not convinced it's an effective way to bring Iran to the negotiating table, if that's indeed what President Trump wants. But I'm also interested in what's our end game. There's roughly 40 million of the 80 million folks in Iran that are on the young side, 25 to 54. They're going to be here a long time. And many of those folks have very pro-American attitudes. How do we seek to work with those younger folks that have a pro-American attitude for a better future for them, yet still hold a tough line with the regime while letting the others know we're open? Thinking long-term, 5, 10, 20 years down the road would be a better move than just thinking about short-term. What are your insights in this area?
It's a very good question. The longest suffering victims of the Iranian regime are the young people of Iran. And whenever there have been major protests, the regime has responded with brutality. And it has been very hard for an organized opposition to emerge in Iran in the way that solidarity emerged in Poland. So, in fact, much of the energy that you see in Iran today is through the women's movement and protesting the mandatory compulsory wearing of the hijab. As you sort of look at our new foreign policy to Iran, it certainly has a diplomatic piece. It has a piece to restore deterrence. One of the most important pieces has been standing with the Iranian people. I recently, a few months ago, taped a video message to the Iranian people outside of the Iranian embassy, which is on Massachusetts Avenue. And I contrasted how we have taken care, the State Department, under its obligations, international obligations, has maintained this embassy. The Iranian regime has turned our embassy into a museum of the Islamic Revolution with "Death to America" spray-painted in signs around the embassy. The Iranian people do not believe in death to America. We believe, as you said, that they are pro-American. And this regime has divided, I think, the Iranian people and the American people in ways that obviously for 40 years have been tragic, I think, for the Iranian people. We're going to continue to stand with them. Much of what we're demanding on that list of 12 are the same demands the Iranian people are making. They don't want to see this regime spend billions of dollars to fund Assad, who uses chemical weapons, while they are struggling at home. We have seen them gravely mismanage their natural resources. I released a report in September of last year. To the best of my knowledge, it's the first report issued by the federal government documenting the environmental destruction of this regime over the last 40 years. I'll give you one example. When this regime came to power, there were 6 ancient dams and 7 modern dams. That was in 1979. Today, there are 600 dams that have been built. They're largely job projects for the IRGC. So the elite get richer and the poor suffer. And so we call these things out. And so when you look at the drought that has plagued all of Iran, it is compounded by this regime's mismanagement. It is a kleptocracy. It is a corrupt religious mafia that serves its own interests and robs its own people blind.
Quickly, let's turn our attention to Egypt. The tankers that go and bring the illicit crude oil from Iran to Syria through the Suez. In March, the Wall Street Journal reported the Egyptian authorities blocked the crossing of at least one tanker. But in May and June, there's been a sharp increase of these shipments of oil despite the escalation of sanctions. Has Egypt become less cooperative in its efforts to prevent illicit Iranian oil shipments from passing through the canal? And in the state's view, does Egypt have an obligation to prevent the oil shipments passing through the canal?
You've asked the right question. It's a very good question. I have made trips to Egypt. Secretary Pompeo has. My colleagues on the National Security Council have traveled there to discuss the very issues that you've raised. Egypt does have to administer the Constantinople Convention as the operator of the Suez Canal. It has certain obligations and responsibilities under that convention. We have had many discussions with them about that. Now that we have zeroed out imports of Iranian crude oil, any oil that is moving on the waters, unless it's going into floating storage or something like that, but if it's leaving Iran and it's not going to floating storage, and it is going to a country, it's illicit. And we have sanctioned it. We have already sanctioned some illicit oil, and we will continue to do that. We have made ship operators around the world to understand that this money, this oil that finds its way into Syria or to Lebanon is IRGC oil. Now that we have used congressional authorities to designate the IRGC and the Quds Force as a foreign terrorist organization, that allows us to prosecute and to hold people criminally liable as a felony the material support to the IRGC and the Quds Force. So we plan to use that authority vigorously. We have used it vigorously in the context of Hezbollah, and we will use it in this context, and we believe there's an opportunity there. We do not believe that any port operator, any ship operator should take on the liability of working with Iranian tankers.
Thank you.
Mr. Kinzinger, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, sir, thank you for being here and for your service. I think it's important at the top of this that we note that when we talk about Iran, we're talking about the government and not the people, two very different things, and I think that's important to distinguish. I think it's interesting in all this. I remember prior to this administration still having concerns about Iranian attacks to troops and interests in the region. So it's not like this is something that's popped up with the election of President Trump. I mean, specifically in our counter-ISIS campaign, there was a lot of worries about what would happen to the re-energized Shia militias in Iraq. And so a quick point to the, I think I would say some, not my friends necessarily on the other side of the aisle, but things we hear the Blame America First crowd that use Cuba, for instance, and Venezuela as a great example of how to do governance. First off, 9/11 was not an inside job. The Bermuda Triangle is not aliens. We landed on the moon, vaccines saved lives, and Iran did the attack in the Gulf. And that's, I think, the biggest thing to understand. You continue to see the conspiracy theorists that pop up that can take any amount of evidence and try to cast blame and say it's a false flag. And usually we relegate those to the very extremes of political discussion. But I think sometimes we're seeing that enter the more mainstream now because, frankly, some people have let politics get in the way of good foreign policy. And I think another point is, look, innocent Iran is not the result of, meanie Americans. The reality is this has been a battle against the United States, our interest, Israel's interest, and our allies' interest for a very long time, for 40 years. I want to ask you a few questions, though. Thinking of Lebanon specifically, is Hezbollah better off with the deal in place or without the deal in place? And I'm going to ask a series of kind of quick ones. So,
When we were inside the Iran nuclear deal, we were not able to use any of our energy or financial sanctions. The energy sanctions come to about $50 billion in revenue, and that is the amount of revenue that a policy of zero imports of Iranian crude oil can achieve.
So I just was in Lebanon, and what I'm hearing is Hezbollah is not better off now.
It's not.
Because of...
It is not. So Iran has less money to spend today on its proxies than it did when this administration took office.
And how much humanitarian aid has Iran sent to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, or to the Houthi population in Yemen?
I'm not aware of any aid that has gone from Iran to the Houthis.
How many people do we estimate have died in the Syrian civil war? A general estimate?
I believe it's around 500,000 who've died in the Syrian civil war, and hundreds of thousands have been displaced.
Do you think Assad could have survived without the help of Iran?
I think it's a very open question. It's certainly that Iran deployed 2,500 IRGC fighters, and they recruited 10,000 fighters from Afghanistan and Pakistan and other parts, so that together that's 12,500 troops that Iran organized. They gave Assad $4.6 billion in lines of credit and billions of dollars in revenue. It would have made a big difference had Iran not been on the field.
And I'll mention that that was during the existence of the Iran nuclear deal. Approximately, I don't need the number, but generally, do you know how many Americans died in Iraq as a result of Iran?
603 Americans were killed by Iran. That is 17% of the total casualties during the Iraq War of Americans who were killed.
Do you know in the last, say, 20 years, how many U.S. military open strikes have we done in Iran?
0.
Do you, let me ask you another, do you see strong nations that are confident in their future sabotaging oil tankers? Is that a typical kind of thing?
It is not a pattern of behavior we've detected in the region.
Has the U.S. ever put limpet mines and sabotaged oil tankers?
No.
And I want to mention a quick point about the Iran nuclear deal. So this was actually signed into law in 2015. The year obviously now is 2019. It's been 4 years, and as we all know, time flies by. And so if you think about that fact, it's pretty incredible. So I want to advance basically 4 years, so that amount of time ahead today. So in 2020, the UN ban on Iranian arms exports and imports will lift under the Iran nuclear deal. In 2023, so basically an exact amount of time from 2015 to today, again, the UN ban on assistance to Iranian ballistic missiles will end, ban on manufacture of advanced centrifuges will begin to expire, assuming congressional approval, U.S. nuclear sanctions will lift. And in that time again, in 2025, snapback provisions will expire. In 2026, the cap on IR-1 centrifuges will lift. The ban on replacing those with more advanced models will expire, and restrictions on centrifuge research and development will end. And in 2031, all restrictions lift. I make that point, sir, for those that think this is some amazing deal that will last perpetually into the future, that we're already halfway to the beginning of this deal starting to expire. And we saw only worse behavior from Iran. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you. And again, Mr. Hook, thank you for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Keating, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to initially say that, years ago when I was in Iraq, just hours later, I did see a rocket-propelled, Iranian rocket-propelled explosive device take the lives of American soldiers that I was eating with just hours before that. So this, in no question, is no way at all to excuse their hostile activities, unexcusable activities, but I want to just look at your testimony a moment and ask a couple of questions. Number one, when you're talking about the non-nuclear activities of Iran, the malign activities, the missile testing, yes or no? The U.S. still had the option for sanctions and other actions, even if we continued with the JCPOA. So we did have options absent leaving the JCPOA. Is that correct, yes or no?
Bad options.
Yes or no? Did we have options?
Bad options.
All right, we had options.
Bad options.
Later on, you're just saying that the decision to perhaps move forward with enrichment is a result of the fatal flaw of the agreement. Wasn't it true that Iran was conforming to the agreement? I've heard no country say that they weren't conforming to the nuclear agreement, abiding by it. And it was only after we tore up that agreement and moved away from a nuclear deal that provided some protection, clear protection, much greater protection from the nuclear threat of Iran, that it was the tearing up of that that was the causal effect, not a fatal flaw that was resulting in that. I think I'll leave that as a statement because you're not likely to agree with it, but I believe it is true. And in your testimony, just to get some consistency, you know, in other hearings we've had in our subcommittee and the committee as a whole, we're looking for policies and consistencies and resolve. The conclusions, even of minority witnesses, we have no Russia policy. We have no China policy. We have no North Korea policy. We have no Syrian policy. So in your testimony, I just want to point out that you said Iran supported Assad's brutal war machine as the Syrian regime killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. Couldn't you say the same thing of Russia? Exactly the same thing of Russia's activities?
I'm going to leave that. We have a special envoy.
No, couldn't you, just as a layman, couldn't you say it?
Well, I want to stay out of Jim's lane. Ambassador.
Well, I don't want lanes here,
No,
because that's precisely the point. If you don't have policies, you can go into lanes that go nowhere.
I'm happy to answer the question. We inherited the Russian military in Syria when we came into office. And so we had options as we were facing ISIS. The president made as his #1 priority the defeat of ISIS. He and Secretary Mattis put into effect a policy that achieved that objective. And so we are very pleased with what we've been able to do to end the territorial caliphate that existed in Iraq and Syria.
But you said in your testimony, as part of the rationale with Iran, is Iran supported Assad's brutal war machine in Syria. It killed hundreds of thousands, displaced. I could make the argument that Russia was more pivotal than any country in turning the tide there, and more responsible than any country other than Assad himself. I mean, so what's the consistency with Russia? Why aren't we dealing with that issue with Russia?
In my statement, I did not say that Iran had eclipsed Russia in culpability.
You left it out.
I'm the Iran envoy. So I cover Iran. I'm trying to make clear what Iran is doing in Syria.
This is the frustration we're having with the administration. Everyone has their lanes. Everyone won't speak. You can't deal with lanes when you're dealing with policy. Well, and there's no overarching policy, and it's moving closer to conflict in this instance. I mean, we're reaching a very serious stage here. Can you just explain to me, finally, in the few seconds I have left, what is that thread from the initial authorization to use military force that exists now, they've been using? Explain to me the thread of how that could be used in this Iranian situation and the current conflict we're in now. To me, the thread doesn't exist. So explain to me where that thread is.
And what do you mean by the thread? Which thread?
The thread that pulls together the authorization to use military force that we're using against terrorists and extremists currently. How does that apply to Iran? I don't see a connection at all.
We have not used military force against Iran. We have enhanced our force posture in the region.
The Secretary said just 2 months ago that that's on the table, that could be used absent action from Congress. So how you're here in your lane representing the Secretary who said that that's something they could do. So I want to explain, since you're here and not the Secretary, I want to ask you, where's the connection? I see none. I think you have to go to Congress to act on any kind of kinetic actions with Iran, absent our instant self-defense.
I had answered that question earlier for the chairman. I'm happy to repeat the answer.
Please.
We will do everything we are required to do with respect to congressional war powers.
No, I asked, that's not answering the same question. Where's the thread? Where's the connection? That's not the same question.
I'm happy to explain this as best I can. We received credible threat reporting in late April and early May that Iran was planning plotting imminent attacks against American interests in multiple theaters. We enhanced our force posture in a defensive mode so that we could protect ourselves if attacked. That's it. That's as far as we've taken this, and no farther.
So there's no threat in the future that I've heard from you. I yield back.
Thank you. I would just let the members know that votes could be called as early as 1:15. The witness has to appear in the Senate at 2, so we won't be able to come back after votes. If members choose to use less than their 5 minutes, we'll be able to get everyone in. I leave that up to you. Mr. Zeldin, I recognize you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Hook, thank you for being here. There was strong bipartisan opposition to the Iran nuclear deal. In this room, I asked Secretary Kerry why the deal was not being submitted as a treaty. The reason was because they were not able to get it passed. That was Secretary Kerry's answer to the question here in this room. There are flaws with the Iran nuclear deal that many have acknowledged in a bipartisan fashion, as Mr. Kinzinger was just discussing with regards to the sunset clauses that are fast approaching. The verification regime. We were told by President Obama, Secretary Kerry, this deal was not built on trust, it was built on verification. They never read the verification regime. I am a member of Congress. None of us have read the verification regime that was entered into between the IAEA and Iran. There are flaws with the verification regime, but we don't even know the full extent of everything that was agreed to. And then third, all of the non-nuclear bad activities, or the malign activities, many which we've gotten into. By withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, much of the leverage is coming back to the table that brought the Iranians to the table in the first place. I'm not surprised at all to see Iran acting out as they're feeling the pressure. They're feeling the pressure from the sanctions. They feel pressure from hardliners within their own country. Some of it is related to the domestic politics, plus they are the world's largest state sponsor of terror, and they have other ambitions. Understanding the scope of the malign activities, non-nuclear activities included test-firing intercontinental ballistic missiles. The intercontinental is not for Israel. The intercontinental was meant for us. The Houthis, helping the Houthis overthrow the government in Yemen, the support for the Assad regime, support for Hezbollah, the activities that we have seen beyond just those, and of course, as Mr. Kinzinger often points out, as he should, the killing of United States service members. We had no leverage left to be able to deal with all these other activities. Some would argue we did have leverage. Well, the Iranians weren't at the table. And the conditions may not yet be set to be able to negotiate something in the middle of June of 2019, but we're getting there, and the strategy is working. Now, I think it's important that you are here to clarify what the Trump administration's policy is with regards to Iran, and I think it's our responsibility as members of Congress to give you that opportunity to clarify it and certainly not to muddy the waters. I believe that President Trump believes that Iran is an adversary that does not respect weakness, only respects strength. We can't be silent not because we want war, but because we want to prevent it. We have many people in our federal government, some might be political appointees, some might be career, who believe in the four instruments of national power, in the diplomacy, information, military economics. There's a belief that by having the military option on the table, that diplomacy, multilateral, bilateral, the information campaign, the economic pressure are all more effective. The military option is the last possible option. I've spent a lot of time with the President of the United States, and we've discussed this topic. The President does not want to go to war with Iran. The President of the United States does not want to go to war with Iran. But there's a belief in the four instruments of national power that by having the option on the table, it's the last possible option, that it helps make the other aspects of our instruments of national power more effective. I also wanted to point out something with regards to the Iranian people. There are millions of Iranians who are great, freedom-loving people who want a better future for their country, and there is no one more motivated in the entire world to have a better direction for their country than those many millions of Iranians who right now, talking about young Iranians and the impact that they're feeling, young Iranians, we're talking about people under the age of 50, 55 people their entire lives and their kids' entire lives have only known this brutal regime that oppresses its own people. With the brief time that we have left, have there been any ways prior to exiting the JCPOA that Iran violated the letter of the JCPOA?
Could you say that one more time?
Before we withdrew from the JCPOA, are there any examples of Iran violating the letter of the JCPOA? For example, assembling additional advanced centrifuges, which Annex 1, paragraph 61 prevented, or exceeding IR6 centrifuge allowances, or twice going over the heavy water amount that the IAEA acknowledged, or refusing access to military sites.
Yes, I remember when I was in Vienna for the meeting of the Joint Commission, I had raised some of these issues. There have been what I have called tactical violations of the Iran nuclear deal. We have not seen a material breach. The regime has recently threatened material breach of the Iran nuclear deal. Best I can do to answer that question.
Yeah, I think it's just important to note, and my time is up, that there have been violations of the JCPOA that a lot of people may not be aware of. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Sherman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a tragedy that the nation that gave us the first human rights document, the Cirrus Cylinder, a nation that has been at the forefront of world civilization for 4 millennia, is ruled by this regime. We need democracy in Iran, but it will not come from an American military force. It will come from the Iranian people. There is discussion, Mr. Hook, of possible military action against Iran. Is it the administration's position or understanding that they need to abide by the War Powers Act, which limits the power of the president to deploy our troops into hostilities?
I think let me first just say, to echo your first point, let's be very clear. The future of Iran will be decided by the Iranian people. Can't say that enough times.
And I would add that the United States has in the past sponsored democracy conferences, reached out through the State Department, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and that America can provide some assistance to those working for democracy in Iran. I would like to see us take all the radio broadcasts that I hear in Los Angeles in Farsi and get them retransmitted very inexpensively, I might add, so that the Iranian people could hear the hundreds of different opinions and see the flowering of different ideas and see what a public free debate is like. But let's go back to the War Powers Act.
As I think I said earlier, we are not looking for military action. We have kept our foreign policy squarely in the guardrails of economic pressure and diplomatic isolation.
I understand that, and I will point out that if the economic pressure we were imposing was given, if we gave the reason for that being Iran's wrongful actions in Syria, which have cost hundreds of thousands of lives, not to mention Yemen, et cetera, and their human rights, we could have stayed in the JCPOA, so they would be bound by it, and they'd still be subject to the same sanctions. But instead, we've pulled out of the JCPOA, which, as you point out, Iran may be in material breach of, and we'll cross that bridge when we get. Well, it's important with the legislative body that we focus on what the legal parameters are. And I know it's not your intention to invade Iran, but this is a discussion of your legal right to do so, or the administration's legal right to do so without Congress. And it's quite possible that you'll come to Congress under extreme conditions and ask for this or that authority. But based on the authorities that you have now, what is the power of this administration? Are they subject to the War Powers Act?
I'm not a War Powers Act scholar. I can only tell you that everything that we would do would be lawful. And everything that we are trying to do now is defensive. I can't underline, there is no talk of offensive action. We are trying to, it's a defensive move that we have made.
it is not the position of the administration that the 2001, and we talked about this earlier, but, that the 2001 authorization to use military force against those who carried out 9/11 would authorize a war against Iran, correct?
I'm not a scholar in this area.
Do you take the, did the Islamic Republic bomb us on 9/11?
Did the Islamic Republic bomb us
Is
on
the
9/11?
Islamic Republic one of the entities responsible for the deaths on 9/11?
No.
Thank you. I would point out that we have had legal scholars in this room talk about the War Powers Act, and those who claim it's unconstitutional have said, however, that the power of the purse is critical and decisive and binding. And I would point out that we will this week pass a defense appropriations bill that contains a provision that we first put in there in 2011 when I offered it as an amendment. We've been able to get into the base text, so nobody's talking about it because we don't have to vote on it, that says that no monies can be spent in contravention of the War Powers Act. So if we were to deploy military forces in contravention of that act, we would not only be in violation of that law, we'd be in violation of the appropriations bill. So I hope very much that we work together to change the policy of this regime short term, particularly with regard to Syria and the Strait of Hormuz, and longer term that we bring democracy to Iran. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Reschenthal. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Hook, for being here today. As a veteran of the Iraq War, I sat face-to-face in the courtroom with members of al-Qaeda, terrorists who had made and planted IEDs, and murderers. I saw firsthand the successes and the failures of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. While our political, military, economic, and technological advantages are unmatched, Iran remains one of the greatest threats destabilizing the globe. As the world's largest state sponsor of terror, Iran continues to sow chaos in Yemen through the Houthi proxies, continues to fund Hezbollah in Lebanon and across the world, continues to prop up the Assad regime in Syria, and chants death to America in its capital of Tehran. Mr. Hook, can you explain the larger strategic benefits and goals of the U.S.-Saudi relationship and the negative impacts of abandoning that relationship as it pertains to U.S. national security interests in Iran?
I think you see our foreign policy emerging quite clearly in Riyadh. The president's first trip overseas was to Saudi Arabia. They had brought together, I want to say, 55 Arab Muslim nations, one of the largest gatherings that anyone can recall. The president spoke, King Salman spoke, and we talked very much about the need to confront extremism and to counter extremism. And we also want to, as part of burden sharing, America, the experiences that you described, there are so many people who can talk about that in our military. And we are doing everything we can to expand burden sharing. And that requires improving the capabilities of our regional partners so that they can be a counterweight to Iran. And that reduces the burden on us to provide the levels that we've done historically. And so whether it's Saudi Arabia or UAE or Jordan, Israel, a number of countries in the region, we very much want to see them in a position of strength and in sovereignty. Iraq, we very much want to see Iraq strong, stable, and sovereign. We want the Iraqi military to have a monopoly on military force. We do not want to see the PMF, especially those that Qasem Soleimani organizes, trains, and equips, to be stronger. We don't need two states within a state. We don't need two militaries within a state. That is what we have in Lebanon. This is the foreign policy agenda of Iran. It is to try to create two militaries and two states within a state, and to stoke sectarian identities, catalyze sectarian identities, and dissolve national identities. When we talk about how Iran destabilizes the Middle East, this is what we're talking about. Iran pours sort of this it adds this religious dimension to political conflicts, which has increased bloodshed and suffering. And so, to the extent that our policy is denying Iran the revenue and a lot of the capabilities it has to support these proxies, that improves the situation in the Middle East.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. I yield to my colleague from New York.
Thank you. Mr. Hook, so is it true that in February 2016 and November 2016 that Iran had acquired more heavy water than they were allowed to under the JCPOA, according to the IAEA?
I can give you the specific answer to that, but we had registered concerns that, and I believe
That could be a yes or a no.
I believe the answer is yes, that they had increased the stockpiling of heavy water.
That's correct.
And and I had raised that when we were in Vienna. It's a while ago now.
Isn't it true that Iran had acquired more than the necessary amount of IR-8 centrifuge rotor assemblies for R&D purposes with 16 times more capacity than the IR-1 to enrich uranium?
Our Assistant Secretary, Chris Ford, will be able to answer that specifically. I don't have that answer in front of me. We're happy to give you the answer to
I would like you to know that, so please, if you can also speak to Mr. Ford as well, because you should be able to answer in the affirmative. Also, Iran, isn't it true that they assembled more IR-6 centrifuges than they were allowed to under the JCPOA?
I believe that is the case. We have a bureau that does only this.
I understand the point, and we had the back and forth earlier, but I think it's important for you to have these answers with regards to their violations while we were in the plan.
Thanks. Votes have been called. We're going to keep going as long as we can. Mr. Liu, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hook, for being here. I agree with you that Iran is a malignant state actor. That is a totally different issue as to who is authorized to allow force to be used against another country. So under our Constitution, does the President have the power to declare war?
I think this is a discussion.
It's not a trick question. Again. Under our Constitution, does the President have the power to declare war? It's just a yes or no. Okay, all right. Let me make it really easy for you. Under the Constitution, Congress has the power to declare war, correct? It's not a trick question, sir. Have you read the Constitution?
We will do everything we are required to do.
Mr. Hook, have you read the Constitution?
I have read the Constitution.
Okay, under the Constitution, the framers gave Congress the power to declare war, correct? Just a yes or no.
My understanding is that we're here to talk about Iran foreign policy, which I can do.
Under the Constitution, the framers gave Congress
on war powers. I believe we should have.
All right, Mr. Chair, I'm going to stop this line of questioning. I'm going to submit the U.S. Constitution for the record.
Without objection.
Okay.
Article 1.
Now, let's ask about crafting Iran policy. You would agree, wouldn't you, that in crafting Iran policy, or actually any policy in the State Department, you want employees who have expertise in that subject area, isn't that right?
We have many experts on Iran in the State Department.
Okay. And you have career employees that have worked in prior administrations, both Democratic and Republican, and they go through different administrations. It would not be appropriate to remove a career employee simply because they worked in an administration of a different party, correct?
That is a personnel question that I would refer you to the personnel
department. Not a trick question. We don't remove career employees because they happen to be working in a prior administration. Isn't that right?
Can you ask the question one more time, please?
Okay, you have career employees that serve based on the administration, that execute that administration's policies. You don't remove them simply because it's a change of administration, right? We're not a political appointees, I'm a career employee.
This is a personnel authorities question that I am not an expert in.
So you think it's okay to actually remove a career employee?
You're asking me I'm not an HR.
I'm asking really simple questions.
No, but you're asking an HR question. I don't do human resources.
All right. Is it appropriate to remove a career employee because of national origin?
I have to assume that that would be inappropriate, but I'm
all right, very good. We got you to answer one question. I'm going to have this committee give you an email. And it's an email that was sent to you on Tuesday, March 14, 2017, from Julia Haller, describing a career employee named Sahar Narazadeh. And in the email, she says, Sahar Narazadeh is on detail to your office, basically SP, and and that she's trying to get her suspended. And she notes, as background, she worked on the Iran deal, specifically works on Iran within SP, which is your office, was born in Iran. Are any of those factors relevant in removing a career employee from details, sir?
This is an email from Julia Haller. I didn't write this email, so I'm just not sure what your question.
But you did respond saying this initial info is helpful. Is it helpful to know that a career employee worked on the Iran deal, works in your office, and was born in Iran?
No, because if you look at I'm looking at this in real time now. It says this official permanently belongs to NEA as a career conditional employee. I asked, what does career conditional mean? Look,
you said this initial info is helpful. Is it helpful to know her national origin?
Congressman, as you know, there is an Inspector General report on this very subject that you're asking about. I am looking forward to the release of that report, and it would be improper for me to comment on this matter until that review has concluded.
Okay, thank you. So Saudi Arabia is viewed by this administration not only as a U.S. ally, but also as a counterweight to Iran in the region. Is that correct?
Saudi Arabia as a counterweight? Yes.
They oppose Iran.
Saudi Arabia is regularly attacked by an Iranian surrogate.
Right. Okay. The UN today reported that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia should be investigated for murdering Jamal Khashoggi. Do you agree with our own CIA's assessment that the Crown Prince ordered the murder of U.S. resident Jamal Khashoggi?
On the subject of that, Secretary Pompeo has made it very clear that we are determined to hold every single person who materially responsible accountable. The Saudi prosecutor has taken important steps toward accountability for the tragic killing of Jamal Khashoggi, but more needs to be done.
Thank you. I look forward to you holding the Crown Prince accountable. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Mr. Watkins, you're recognized.
Thanks, sir. Thanks for being here, Mr. Hook. Does the administration hold the long-held belief to assure freedom of navigation throughout the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, and other waterways?
Yes, it's an important national security and economic priority.
Last week, the president tweeted, it is too soon to even think about making a deal. They're not ready, neither are we. What do you believe it'll take in order for Iran to begin negotiations, sir?
From the time we left the deal, we made it very clear that we want a diplomatic solution to the broad range of threats that Iran presents to international peace and security. We have made that repeatedly. The president has done it repeatedly, that he is ready to sit down. Secretary Pompeo said he will sit down without preconditions. President Trump endorsed Prime Minister Abe making an historic visit to Iran to pursue a diplomatic outcome and to lead to talks. The supreme leader of Iran put out a few tweets that made it very clear that he will not even listen to the president. And then for good measure, he attacked a Japanese-owned tanker. Iran continues to reject American overtures for a diplomatic solution. And we have seen no relaxing of that. And we have made it also very clear that Iran can either start behaving like a normal country or it can watch its economy crumble. And we are committed to driving up the costs of Iran's violent foreign policy.
Final question, Mr. Hook. The regime in Tehran is one of the world's worst human rights abusers. How does that, or does that, and how does that weigh into the calculus of our dealings with Tehran?
In September, I put out a report that was released during the UN General Assembly, and I devoted an entire chapter to Iran's human rights violations. I'll give you one example. There was one Canadian Iranian who founded I think it was the Persian Wildlife Foundation. He was arrested and then died in prison. You have Iranians who protest because they want clean air and they want clean water and they want to protect wildlife, and the regime responds by killing them. You have women around Iran who are denied their basic dignity. And so we stand very strongly with the Iranian people, especially Iranian women.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Mr. Hook. Mr. Chamberlain, you're back.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins. I now recognize Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you. Let me start by echoing the chairman's comments about our hostages, including Bob Levinson, whose family are constituents of mine. And I just really hope that we prioritize this diplomatically and not subsume it in a sea of demands that are much less likely to be met in the near term. And now I have a few questions. Sir, the president in recent days has said that the Iranian attacks on the tankers in the Gulf were very minor. What did he mean by that?
When you were looking at the sort of intelligence that we were seeing, and I don't know, Congressman, if you've seen it yet, but the intelligence that we were seeing were suggested attacks, I think, on a very significant scale, and that were also directed at American interests.
All right. He also said that Iran is a much different country today than it was 2.5 years ago when, quote, I came to office. We're not hearing death to America anymore, he said. He seemed, and emphasized that his main interest is dealing with the nuclear issue. What does he mean by that?
Iran is, by almost every metric, weaker today than when it was over 2 years ago when we came into office. We think that that's just simply raw numbers. And I discussed some of those in my opening statement. And so it is weaker.
Okay. It's a little, I mean, the implication of his statement was that they were a little less threatening, that the policy had been successful. And I'm asking because I think there's a disconnect, if I may, between what we hear from different parts of the administration. When I listen to the president, it seems on most days that what he is primarily interested in is improving on the nuclear deal, which was obviously flawed, perhaps extending or eliminating the sunset clause, et cetera. What I hear from you is very different. What I hear from you is that our policy is to bankrupt Iran until they meet this maximalist set of 12 demands, until they become a normal country, as the Secretary Pompeo and you just said, demands that include basically cutting off ties with all of their proxy forces in the region, the nuclear issue just one small part of it. So which is it? Are we using these sanctions to improve the nuclear deal, or are we using the sanctions to fundamentally change the nature of the Iranian regime?
You've mentioned one quote. I think you have to look at the quotes in their totality. We have quotes, but we also have speeches. And the president has also made a couple of addresses to the UN General Assembly, laying out in more detail some of these concerns that you talked about. Money is the sinews of war. And if we don't go after the money, Iran is able to fund its proxies, which then have direct consequences for American interests in the Middle East. Our goal is not, you had said it, I never said that we're trying to bankrupt the regime. I said that we're trying to make their foreign policy prohibitively expensive. And that's the right policy. It would be, I think, diplomatic malpractice to somehow encourage Iran to have more money so that they can spend on their proxies.
But you're reaffirming your point, which is the purpose of the sanctions is to change their entire foreign policy. It's not just to deal with the nuclear issue. Let me read you a quote from another speech from Secretary Pompeo, who said, of the people of Iran will get to, quote, will get to make a choice about their leadership. If they make the decision quickly, that would be wonderful. If they choose not to do so, we will stay hard at this until we achieve the outcomes I set forward, the 12 demands. So basically, we're saying to the Iranian people, you have to change the entire foreign policy of your country, or we are going to continue these, what you refer to as crippling sanctions. That seems rather inconsistent with where the president is and somewhat hard to achieve.
The president, if you look at what he has said over the last couple of years, he has taken a comprehensive approach to the entire range of threats that Iran presents. The nuclear threat is obviously the one that has the biggest consequence, okay? And so we prioritize that. That does not mean, though, that we're going to look the other way on the missile testing, the space launch vehicles, the missile proliferation, the regional aggression, the human rights abuses. And I think one of the traps that the international community fell into was that as soon as you said Iran is in compliance with the deal, it ended the conversation. And it obscured all of the ways that Iran has used the Iran nuclear deal to destabilize the Middle East. It made them stronger. It gave them more money. It has a weak inspections regime. It is silent on ICBMs. And it expires. And so rather than wait for all of these things to come to pass in 10 years when Iran is stronger, we have pulled that forward. But I truly believe that everything we are seeing today is inevitable.
So if we fix the deal, the sanctions remain in place, is what you're saying, until everything else is fixed?
No. What I've said is that our sanctions have two purposes, and I said this in my opening statement: to deny the regime the revenue it needs to run an expansionist foreign policy, and to bring them back to the negotiating table.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. The votes have been called. Mr. Hook needs to get to the Senate, which leaves just enough time for Mr. Cicilline to recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hook, I'm very concerned that the actions taken by this administration over the past 18 months have isolated the United States and brought us closer to war. Since we abandoned the JCPOA, there hasn't been any perceivable improvements in our position vis-a-vis Iran. In fact, the situation seems to have escalated considerably, and we're now isolated from our allies on this point. And I fear that there are people within the administration who see war with Iran as not only inevitable but desirable, a position I cannot fathom due to the destruction it would cause. I want to associate myself with my colleagues' remarks, particularly the chairman's, about the absence of an authorization to strike Iran under any existing AUMF or constitutional authorities. I'm not asking you to posit an opinion. I think the text of the Constitution is quite clear. And with respect to the notion that al-Qaeda is the basis, in the testimony that the Secretary Pompeo made, and where he tried to make that argument, it should be noted that, in fact, al-Qaeda and its affiliates are Sunni extremists who consider Shia, like Iran's government, to be heretics. And a 2018 analysis of declassified documents obtained during the 2001 raid on Osama bin Laden's compound found that al-Qaeda views Iran as a hostile entity. So this notion of that being authorization is clearly non-existent. But you said in your testimony that we have made, our strategy is working. Based on what?
I'm happy to go over it again with you. I'll give you one example. Under the Iran nuclear deal, Iran's military spending reached record highs. In this administration, the first year it was down 10%, and then starting in March, it's down 29%.
So a strategy, I guess maybe the question is, what's the strategy is to achieve what objective? Maybe that's the question.
Our strategy is to get to a new and better deal that we would submit to the Senate as a treaty,
which
is a mistake that the prior administration, we think that the last deal should have been submitted to the Senate, and they went around the Congress and they found the votes in the UN Security Council.
That's sort of rich on the sort of the moment that Iran is about to increase its capabilities to, in fact, develop a nuclear weapon as a result of us walking away from the agreement. But, you know, Secretary Pompeo in May of 2018 stipulated a list of 12 behavior changes by Iran that would meet U.S. conditions for normalization. And he said at that time, and when I said at that time, it looked like more of a wish list than any actual set of policy proposals or a strategy to achieve them. But as of today, which of the 12 demands that were articulated by the Secretary have been successfully met in the intervening time period?
I don't have the 12 in front of me.
Well, have any of them been met? Let me make it easy for you.
Well, they're the regional aggression. We have weakened their proxies. We have also denied revenues to the regime to fund its missile program and its nuclear program. The regime is weaker today than it was, so it doesn't have the money that it used to spend on the areas that we are seeking change in. That's the nuclear, missiles, and regional aggression.
But hasn't your argument been all day, and the administration's argument, their behavior has gotten worse? Isn't that the whole point?
No. Iran still, even with very little revenue, has an asymmetric capability that terrorists have. The costs of the 9/11 operation were quite inexpensive. That is the advantage that terrorism has today. It's asymmetric advantage. And so it is the case that the regime has tens of billions of dollars of less revenue today than when it did before our sanctions took effect. That does not mean that we have eliminated their asymmetric threats.
And Mr. Hook, do you believe, you know, one of the issues that Secretary Pompeo included in his Iran policy proposal related to human rights, and I'm curious, do you who believe that the president's embrace of authoritarian rulers such as North Korea's Kim Jong-un or Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman enhances or undercuts the human rights demands that Secretary Pompeo included in his proposal?
I can speak to Iran, and in the case of Iran, he has coupled economic pressure with an off-ramp for diplomacy. The Iranians have rejected that off-ramp.
That's not my question. My question is the administration and the president's in particular, his embrace of authoritarian rulers with a gross disregard for human rights, does that make our demand for human rights concessions from the Iranians more likely, less likely, or no impact? It seems hard to reconcile the two. I'm just wondering, as the person in charge of this effort, does that have some impact?
I don't share the premise of your question when I look at the sort of pressure that we have put in place on authoritarian regimes. And the president, I think, and I can only speak to Iran, has made very clear that while we do have very strong economic measures in place, he has encouraged Iran to call so that we can begin talks. And our Secretary of State has said without preconditions. And we're also doing this while we're highlighting the human rights abuses of this regime.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Hook, thank you so much for appearing before our committee today. We appreciate it. Thanks to the members who have come. Members will have 5 legislative days to submit questions or materials, additional materials for the record. And without objection, this subcommittee is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.